We are in a milieu of irrationality in terms of how to deal with the subject. And so the question is, how do we move successfully in the face of irrationality? And as I listened to people, it was clearer and clearer to me about, in my own practice, how surgical we have to be if we're going to take on the government in issues like these. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Santo Daime. I've been representing them for 15 years. Back in 2000, there was an interception of tea being brought into the country for the Santo Daime, and there was one for the União de Vegetal. And so I was asked to represent the Santo Daime. And by the way, as I begin this, let me note Jeffrey Bronfman is here, and the work that the União de Vegetal did was amazing and wonderful, as we did, and we all came out in good shape because we had the resources to actually do this work. Now, how do you win a case like this? What dawned on me, and I do this in practice and I'll talk about it in a bit, is what's the genesis of these irrational laws? Where did they come from? You know, we're a pretty civilized society, and so I'm going to talk a bit about that. I don't know whether Luis Eduard Luna is here or not, but regarding the genesis of all of this, Luis said the following, and this is, we're now in Brazil and we're in Peru, and the Inquisition has begun. Prior to that, the use of ayahuasca by various tribes and religions was not interfered with. In Brazil, there had been a government study, and somebody touched on it back in 85, 86, because the use of ayahuasca was growing and growing in Brazil. And the government appointed a commission to study it and to advise the government whether or not this practice should be permitted. And there were social scientists, drug policy experts, medical doctors, psychiatrists, a very wide array of relevant scientists came together, and they went to various villages and towns, both where the UDV was operating and where the Santo Daime was. They did the tea. They spent time in the communities, and what they concluded was that in villages where ayahuasca was being used sacramentally, and in a sense, as I listened to myself saying when it was used sacramentally, it was, prior to the Inquisition, the sacrament. There was no question about if somebody's doing ayahuasca, are they doing it recreationally? That concept didn't even exist then. But I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. This is what Luna writes, talking about the Inquisition and what happened to indigenous practices. The invaders readily understood the religious connotation of the use of these plants. The shamans were violently prosecuted by the religious authorities of the conquerors, which considered these plants to be a vehicle for contact with the devil. Now, in a sense, in a humorous way, well, if you believe in the devil, isn't the devil a religious icon? So it was kind of reaffirming that which it was trying to destroy. There was a systematic and devastating persecution of Amerindian religious practices by Christian missionaries of various creeds, or by medical or secular authorities which considered this to be sorcery. So that's when ayahuasca went underground. There were thousands of shamans that were murdered. And that was back in 1500s, 1600s. Now, what does that have to do with today? On that one, Richard Wolff, who spoke this morning, wrote the following 15 years ago. Strangely enough, the Spanish Inquisition is still with us in form, but instead of the churches having their own police. Our governments now do this job for them. Church doctrine is now enforced by civil and criminal law. It has been that way so long we just don't recognize what's happening. And the churches pay no fee for these enforcement services. In fact, they pay no taxes at all. He says, what a deal. The mythical separation between church and state here is really just that, a myth. Now, why am I reading that? The reason I'm reading it is because we have to, when we take on one of these monstrous cases, we have to be able to establish what the predicate is for where we are today. And so it's not simply something I'm telling you all, but it's really important to an understanding of where we are. So we did not have, prior to the enactment of the Controlled Substances Act in the 70s, it wasn't based on good science. It was based upon what occurred from the church and continuing that. And as Richard noted, well, they kind of forgot that all these laws are really acts of the church, because the church considered this stuff to be the act of the devil. And that's the basis for making these substances criminal, not good science. Now, what does that mean? It means if we can show this, if we can establish this, we start off by establishing that these substances, there is no evidence that the government had put together before it enacted the laws. Generally, our Congresses or our parliaments, they have a rational basis for enacting law. There was none here. It was an outgrowth of the Inquisition and an overlay of the 60s generation. Now, it was so irrational that I want to read this. Dr. Hollister was the chief psychiatric officer for the Veterans Administration in the United States and was considered the foremost experts on drugs. Every time I do this, I still can't believe I'm reading it. Here's what he said to Congress. I can find no colleagues who will state that the scheduling of these drugs makes any sense. Top man in the government. Nor can I find anyone who was consulted about this proposed scheduling. And he's referring to the fact that marijuana, heroin, peyote, they were all in the same schedule. And there was no one who could say there was any rational basis for that. This scheduling, which groups together such drugs as diverse as heroin, marijuana, and LSD, perpetuates a fallacy long apparent to our youth. These drugs are not equivalent in pharmacological effect or damage to individuals or society. And so we have a second bit of evidence here, and that's that there was no reason, it was irrational to lump these together. In the marijuana, in the Santo Daime situation, you're saying 5 minutes left? Yes. No, I'm sorry. It's going to take me at least a half hour to do this. No, I'm kidding. I'm sorry. So my task, and the task of the lawyers who take this work on, is to debunk these myths. But the first part of the case, and a lot of people touched on this, is you have to establish that the use of ayahuasca is as a sacrament in a bona fide religion. There was discussion of shamanism this morning, and there was a discussion of, well, what's a religion? And the courts are not clear about this. But what we have to do is we bring to the courts that which courts have held are indicia, some of the indicia of religion. And how do we do that? We do that by having the teaching shaman discuss his lineage, his beliefs, And those can establish that this is a religious practice. So all of the ayahuasqueros that I've been representing, when I ask them, please talk about what your spiritual beliefs are. I believe in a great spirit. I believe that the earth is the incarnation of the deity. I believe all is oneness. I believe evolution is an act of the divine that will continue forever. These types of statements our court systems have considered religious. And so what we do is we put on the shaman, or the maestro terms we use. In the Santo Daime, it's the padrinos, and they talk about their religious experience and their teachers. Now, right now, I'm representing one shaman who's Anglo. The Santo Daime, because it was, and I guess I'm assuming that people here, most people know about the Santo Daime. Can I get a show of hands? Who does not know about the origin and founding of the Santo Daime, if you do not know? So most people do know. Briefly, I'm backtracking a bit. Briefly, there was a black rubber tapper who was acting as a guard at the border between Peru and Brazil and started doing ceremonies with a Peruvian ayahuasquero. And during one such ceremony, he had a vision of the Queen of the Forest, who he recognized as being the incarnation of Mary, Mother Mary. He was told to go into the forest and take the tea, the ayahuasca tea, for 7 days, and he would be taught a new religious practice. And that was and became the Santo Daime Church. So it was a Christian church. He grew up as a Catholic, and he had the vision that the ayahuasca was the new sacrament, not in derogation of the wine and the bread, but it was a new sacrament. The irony of all of it is that it was the Catholic Church that ran the Inquisition, murdered all the shamans, and then it was the Catholic Church that became the vehicle for the practice to come back and be recognized again. So I hope that gives you a little bit of that background. So the question is, how do we get a white Anglo judge to understand these foreign concepts? And what we do is we make them less foreign. How do we do that? We put on professors of comparative literature who talk about, well, these are the same essential type of belief systems that pervade Christianity. Belief in a deity, so we call Jesus. So we do that. That's step number one. Now, I started to tell you about an Anglo shaman that I'm representing, and it makes it a little harder not to have an indigenous person as the shaman. Now, there's nothing legal or factual about it, but the reason you're seeing some of the irrationality in these decisions is because one judge can get the same set of facts as another judge. They can be equally smart judges. One's going to rule one way, one's going to rule another way. Why is that? It's the feeling and the taste, ultimately. You look at a Supreme Court decision, 5 judges say one thing, 4 judges say another thing. They're equally well-written opinions. So why did it work that way? It's because of their personal cosmology. And so one of the things I want to project to whoever is out here involved in doing any of the legal work, what you want to do is you want to get the sympathy. You want to get the judge on your side. You want the judge to say, oh, I get this stuff. It's kind of like being a Christian or a Jew. These are religious beliefs. So getting that taste is enormously important. Once we establish that it's a religion and it's a religious practice, then the next step is, well, what does it mean if they prohibit the tea? Why does the criminal law have anything to do with this? Well, because if they have the tea taken away, or if they can't have the tea, and it's the central practice of the religion will have to die. And so it's a substantial burden on a religious practice to take the sacrament away. Once you've established that you have a viable religion and that the tea is the sacrament of that religion, and that if it's taken away, it's a burden. The burden then shifts to the government to establish why, in the face of that religious issue, the government still has the right to prohibit the use of the tea. The government must establish that it has a, what we call, compelling interest in prohibiting the possession and distribution of the tea. And there was some brief discussion of how under the European articles, the other side, don't dare put that in front of me and say 0. She said 0. Any questions? I have, oh my God. I do want to say 1 or 2 quick things. And this is to be protective of all of you. There's a lot of ceremonies happening where people are not trained. They haven't been to Brazil. And that is not good. That is dangerous for everybody. Because if there's a wrong bust, then the issue of diversion of the tea becomes one the government can seize on. Second other thing is somebody talked about, well, we have to have medical forms because we don't know who's going to turn us in. You want to have medical forms. You never, ever should have a ceremony without a medical form that sets forth the diseases the person has had, that they understand the nature of the practice. There are so many things you can do wrong. And I sit here and say to you that some of us have put in an enormous amount of our lives, and I love the work, my God, don't come to me if you have a car accident. We don't want to have people being sloppy. So I could go on and on.